On behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I would like to welcome you to today's event, which highlights John Paul Himka and his recent work, Ukrainian Nationalists and the Holocaust. His book is available through Columbia University Press and wherever books are sold. This event is part of the 1939 Society Program in Holocaust Studies, and we would like to thank everyone for staying socially distant, although I guess you don't have to do that anymore, but and intellectually engaging with us by joining in these virtual events with the center continues to hold. John Paul Himka is an Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Alberta. He has written 5 major monographs on Ukrainian history, including the one that we'll be discussing today, Ukrainian Nationalists and the Holocaust, which came out in 2021. Aside from his monographs, he served in an editorial capacity for another 10 books on Ukrainian and Eastern European history, including a book he co-edited called Bringing the Dark Past to Light, the Reception of the Holocaust and Post-Communist Europe, which came out in 2013. He has also authored innumerable articles on Ukrainian history and on the Holocaust in particular, and I would encourage everyone to go out and read all of these books and all of these articles which may take up a lot of your time, but maybe work backwards from the book today. So I would like to welcome John Paul Himka joining us today in a conversation about his new book. So we'll jump right into the questions. We're going to use a kind of interview format today, and I'll have a set of questions all ready for our discussion. So to begin, your book, Ukrainian Nationalism and the Holocaust, begins with a rich and detailed account of the historiographical debates on the role of various Ukrainian nationalist organizations in the Holocaust. And I was wondering, just to start us off today, if you could provide us with a brief overview of these debates over the decades. And I realize this is could take up our entire interview, but just a brief overview of these debates and kind of how you see your own book specifically fitting into this discussion.
Yeah, if I were to take key moments of the debate, I would say that there were like 2 parallel streams of historiography. One was Ukrainian, within Ukrainianist historiography, and the other was Jewish, Israeli in particular, and they were kind of on very separate paths, and that was because in the Ukrainian more national historiography, there was no admission of participation in the Holocaust, and in the Israeli and I would say also Jewish, because Philip Friedman would be in this school, and he was actually in New York with Yivo. They knew that there had been Ukrainian participation in the Holocaust, but for a long time we're kind of unable to really identify the correct factors. And all of this was complicated by legal proceedings and courts. So the Ukrainian community was very upset by the trial of Ivan Demyanjuk that began in the 70s. And then there was in Canada the Deschênes Commission, which looked for Ukrainian war criminals. And this resulted, I would say, in warping the historiographical situation. The responses on both sides really didn't do much with evidence. As you probably know, the Ivan Demyanjuk was the wrong guy for Ivan the Terrible, and then so many Jewish authors or authors associated with the Wiesenthal centers thought the SS, the Waffen-SS division Galician, was a major perpetrator, and kind of missing the fact that it was the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which we call UPA, that were the major factors in the Holocaust. So you had this going on for a while. Then there was, I would say, the next major moment in the debate was in the 1990s, when Ukraine became independent. There was a strong local cult in Galicia, the westernmost part of one of the most westernmost parts of Ukraine, a cult of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. which resulted from a series of factors, which I've just recently written about, but not published. And when they were trying to decide whether OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the UPA, the Insurgent Army, could be rehabilitated, there were strong pressures from some of the population. But the people who were looking at the rehabilitation were historians who were all raised on the Soviet narrative. And in their narrative, the real problem was not that OUN or UPA killed Jews and killed Poles in massive numbers. It was that they had betrayed the fatherland to which they were only incorporated in 1939 to 41 for 21 months. So it was very easy, actually, for the historians under Stanislav Kulczycki and others to realize that, no, they didn't, it's hard to say they betrayed the fatherland. And they ignored completely, for a long time, the mass murders committed by OUN and UPA. Major breakthrough was in 2001, or 2000, depending which languages you read. Jan Gross published Neighbors. And that all of a sudden turned attention to the fact that more than the Germans were involved in the Holocaust, and that very brutal things were done on the ground, as kind of intimate killing, which your dissertation talks about quite a bit. So those, I would say, were major debates, and I would say after Gross began to turn his attention to non-German perpetrators. The other thing about Gross that was very, very important was that he wanted to reintegrate Jewish testimonies, survivor testimonies, which had become baggage left behind. The old Israeli historians had always used testimonies. But after Raoul Hilberg in 1961 published his Destruction of the European Jews, everybody thought only the German documents were important. So Gross began to look at what were the victims saying? What were bystanders saying? And the third thing that Gross did that was very important was that he wrote his book, Neighbors, after decades of work on modern Polish society, and in particular on Poles under the General Gouvernement, the German Rump Poland, and in Western Ukraine, where he wrote a book called Revolution from Abroad. So he knew these societies well, had worked on World War II, had never dealt with the Holocaust. And then at one point, I'm not sure what the revelation was, but he began to work on it. And he saw that things, that this was a very important topic. And I want to add that as a result, he had a deep knowledge of Eastern European society, in particular Polish society. So when he wrote about these things, it was not like many scholars who, of necessity, parachuted into these territories with only a knowledge of German. Some great work was done by them, but this now gave a kind of plasticity and texture to the historical studies. And I had always been kind of interested in these topics, but that's maybe another story. But and then I and a whole bunch of other people, Jeffrey Birch began to write about the nationalists in a very important way. There was work by Per, Anders Rudling, by Grzegorz Ossoliński-Liebe, by Marko Carenek, by a whole group of people who began to really rethink the Ukrainian national narrative.
Great. And so, in building on this, you've already made reference to this, this question of sources. And I think one of the great things about this book is it can be read by both scholarly and public audiences with equal comfort. And I think each of those groups will get different things out of this book. But one thing your kind of general reader, the general public may not recognize from the text itself is just really the extraordinary breadth and depth of research demonstrated in your book. You integrate a range of materials in many languages from archives all around the world. So just another kind of brief stop over here before we get to the real heart of the book. Just curious about some of the challenges you faced in bringing together so many different sources to bear on this project, and also to flag from your previous comment this question of Jewish testimonies and voices, and use this phrase you just used, baggage left behind, and that's, I think, something really important and interesting to hear more about.
Okay, well, challenges, I don't know if I could have done this work that I did were it not for things like the digital revolution, the institutions like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, Yad Vashem, the USC Shoah Foundation, that made so much available. When I tried to use the archives in Ukraine, I had problems. So I actually relied primarily on all the scans that were done, and so I wasn't traveling so much. I was collecting, gathering, and then reading and thinking, in that way. But when you talk about problems of sources, I think there are a series of really important issues to discuss. So one is, I mentioned the fact that Hilberg relied on the German documents. There's a great attraction to that because you can see who is ordering whom to do what. You have it in detail. The Germans clearly documented what they were doing. They tried to destroy some of it, but they certainly didn't destroy much of it because they had so much information on the Holocaust. So there was this temptation that you got this bird's eye view of what happened in the Holocaust, because now the Germans were telling you everything. But there are a couple of problems with that. But one of the main problems is that they ignored whole issues. So it's very hard to understand rescue from German documents. Almost impossible to understand Jewish resistance, which was very important and much underestimated. They weren't interested in local participation except as objects. So these were problems. There was also a more serious problem I read about, which is that it is looking at these tragic and criminal events from the point of view of murderers. And that's not the best way to look at things. You also have to hear what other people who are involved in this process are experiencing and what they're thinking. We have some documentation on that. I can understand why Hilberg liked what he did and why Holocaust scholars have been so enchanted by it, because when it comes to like my studies of O'un and UPA, well, I don't have that kind of documentation where, the central office in some place sends out circulars and gets reports back. And there's some of that, but a lot was oral. We are dealing with a conspiratorial organization because the OUN and UPA were underground formations, even in interwar Poland, where they originated. They did not have a public face. So it's harder to get change of command, and all the more important to bring different kinds of sources together to establish things. So, for example, I tried as much as possible in my book, for every incident I mentioned, to bring OUN documents, their own documents of what they think they're doing, German documents where they're available, testimonies of survivors and of Ukrainians, memoirs. I tried to get as much different views in order to try to understand what actually happened. And I have to say that my favorite phrase in a review of this book was that it's like reading a 19th century positivist, because I'm interested in the facts, right? There's zero theory in my book, zero, right? I don't think I cite Foucault once even. And anyways, so, that's a very important, the centrality of German documents in the Holocaust. Thank God, I think we moved beyond it. We're still trying to figure out how to use the testimonies. Soviet materials are a complex topic, but I think that it's now being studied enough that we know what's true and what's false in their documentation. There are certain things that are clearly falsifications, or at least it's suspected to be falsifications. But on the whole, the Soviet archives are valuable sources. They're the same things when people study the famine in Ukraine, the Holodomor of 1932 to 33. They also use the Soviet documents. So I think they've got a legitimacy, but you have to be careful with them. They're also not exactly, they're not the Nazis, they're not doing the Holocaust, but they have agendas of their own. They're quite brutal. Most surprising to me with working with the Soviet materials, especially war crimes trials of policemen and OUN members, was that they never contradicted the general story. They only contradicted whether they personally participated. They would say, 20 of us went out and we gathered the Jews of this village and they were shot, but I didn't shoot. No, and everybody's not shooting in their testimony. And sometimes very hard. And the Soviets had a kind of rough justice, of course, but there was some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, a rationality to it, which is or legality to it in the post-war period, in that they would not sentence a person to murder, to execution for murder on suspicion. They needed proof. They needed a witness or a document, something like that.
I guess being called a 19th century German positive could be a compliment or not, depending on who's giving it. I'll have to read that review. So maybe to kind of dive in a little bit more. So the title of your book refers to broadly Ukrainian nationalists, but the subtitle kind of tells us who we're going to be focusing on in the book. And you've already made reference to these two groups already, the OUN or OUN and the UPA or the UPA. So just to kind of introduce our listeners, so who may not be familiar with these groups, just again, very shortly, broadly, who are they, why are they important, and why are they the subject or focal point of your book?
Okay, first of all, when I talk about Ukrainian nationalists throughout the book, I only mean members or sympathizers of those two organizations, because I don't think, for instance, people who promoted Ukrainian education at a time when it was persecuted can be considered anywhere near these people in terms of their ideological location. Okay, so the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was founded in 1929. I think that in itself helps to explain a lot about where they were going. 1929 was the year that the Depression began. It was 4 years before Hitler came to power. So an organization that was maybe I should go back just a little bit further before I locate them there. After World War I, with the collapse of the Russian, Ottoman, German, and Habsburg empires, numerous new states were founded. So there'd never been a Latvia before. There'd never been an Estonia before. never a Czechoslovakia, never a Yugoslavia, never a Finland, you know, and then states that had been long dead like Poland and Lithuania emerged. But the Ukrainians in their struggle for independence failed, and they failed totally. They were not able to hold on to anything. And those who follow, the veterans of that struggle, very often were drawn to a much more ruthless approach. The first commandment of the kind of 10 commandments of Ukrainian nationalists is you will achieve a Ukrainian state, or you will die in the struggle for it. So this is what they were after. They wanted Europe to be, they wanted the post-war Versailles settlement to be torn apart. They wanted Poland to be reduced to its kind of ethnic borders, which it is today, after much ethnic cleansing. And they wanted the Soviet Union to collapse. So a figure like Hitler coming in 1933, who wanted to redraw the map of Europe, who wanted to put all Germans in one state on a national principle, who then broke up these federative states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. This was an attraction to this particular political faction in Ukrainian life. It seemed that this guy was going to finally do it, and there were a number of statements that were made by the National Socialists in Germany that seemed to be kind of pro-Ukrainian. So they went on that Hitlerite bandwagon. Yeah, just like today, Ukraine is struggling for its kind of state existence. So the allies are the Americans and the West, and they cannot say, well, what we want to be like is we want to be like, a fascist state, right? They want to be a democratic state. These things are very situational. I think it's very unfortunate that Olin was born in 1929. But even so, in the beginning, I would say for the first 5 or so years, there was lively discussions about the way forward. But when Hitler came to power, he really was like a magnet. So it developed more anti-Semitism, really, really nasty anti-Semitism, which had been not ingrained in the party before the second half of the 30s, really. There were still discussions about how to incorporate the Jewish population into the Ukrainian state as a positive force. There were still, discussions on a number of issues that after a time began to become more turgid, more solidified. So it was anti-Semitic. It had anti-authoritarian, anti-democratic, anti-socialist. Dictatorship was what they felt the country needed. A strong man. Even though some of the leaders had been, like Konovalis and Andriy Melnik, had been involved in trying to stop the earlier pogroms of Ukrainian forces in 1919. So that people who had been relatively decent all of a sudden found themselves in a situation where they're making choices like that. So it developed a fascistic coloring by the 30s. When the war breaks out in 1939, they think this might be their chance, except that there was the Soviet interlude. In 1939, September 17th, the Soviets advanced on parts of Poland, which were inhabited by Ukrainians, and they ruled that territory for 21 months. A brutal rule, absolutely. Massive deportations, arrests, suspicion, nationalization of all businesses. Nobody liked them, hardly. Sometimes some elements of the population might, but on the whole, no. they had made a real bad image of themselves. When the Soviets came in, all Ukrainian political parties, all Ukrainian press, all Ukrainian associations and organizations under Soviet rule were disbanded, or they dissolved themselves, so that the Soviets left a clean slate. Only one political party could survive because they had long time experience in the underground and in conspiracy, and that was the OUN. So they actually increased their numbers under Soviet rule, because I think Soviet rule was so unpopular in the region. Then June 22nd, 1941, the Germans come in and they start their mayhem, and OUN for a while collaborates overtly and closely with the Germans. But since the Germans will not permit a Ukrainian state, relations become more complicated. But nonetheless, OUN in the summer of 1941 is involved in the mass violence against the Jewish population. And then many members of OUN infiltrate the police, and OUN has a program for infiltrating the police, and the police are the absolute most important instrument for the mass liquidation of the traditional Jewish population in that territory. And then in the spring of 1943, OUN founds an insurgent army, the UPA, which fights in a lot of different directions, but also kills Jews systematically, and Poles, but Jews is the subject of my book. So I think that, and then but it's also important to say that then when the Soviets reconquered in 1944, OUN-UPA went underground again, survived, gained new recruits, and waged a partisan war against the Soviets.
Great. So you've already made reference now a few times to Jan Gross. Of course, his book Neighbors came out in English in 2001. That really not only had an effect on the sort of Polish historiographical tradition, but now, as from your comments, we can see from the Ukrainian one as well. And we really see a lot of new work on this question of the pogroms of 1941 at the beginning of the Second World War, really growing in the 2000s and up until present. And in one of your own works prior to this book was a standalone article on the pogroms in Lviv of summer 1941. And this features in the book, and you also build upon this with a more kind of extensive discussion of the violence, this pogrom violence of summer of 1941. So we'd like to hear more about the role that the OUN played in these pogroms, how you would kind of situate this more infamous Lviv pogrom among many of the others that you talk about in the book, maybe just as a couple of jumping off points for this discussion.
Well, okay, so Lviv pogrom, and this also refers to Zolochiv and maybe one other locality in Galicia. These were pogroms in which the urban population took part. So the local Ukrainian and Polish population took part in these pogroms, and they were spectacles. So in the Lviv pogrom and in these kind of urban pogroms, Jews were forced to, let's say, carry statues of Stalin or sing Soviet songs, or the women were humiliated, stripped of their clothes and put on display to the population. Jews were made to walk on their hands and knees to the prisons with their arms raised above their heads. It's a spectacle. It's a spectacle, and it involves a lot of the population. OUN was involved in every one of those kind of incidents. There weren't a lot of them. But it's a place like Leve. There had been a pogrom there in 1918. There were a lot of pogroms there during World War I, various times. So kind of with the Germans coming, there was an expectation. So was the kind of police force of, they had militias. OUN had his own militia, the Ukrainian National Militia, and it did kind of policing jobs for the German invaders. And so when, for instance, the Germans wanted to round up Jews for mass murder, they would have the militia go and find the Jews, because after all, the Germans were coming from pretty far away, and only the locals knew, like, the Jewish neighborhoods, the peculiarities of Jewish dress, and they knew the people. So OUN did roundups at that time. But there's another whole series of things that occurred, and that's where OUN militants from the militia would gather Jews in villages or small towns and either murder a large number of them, or if it was a small population, all of them. So, and in the first cases, in these big pogroms, that I think was closely allied to the Germans, while these small pogroms that I've mentioned, in the smaller towns and villages, that was kind of OUN's own work, as it because OUN identified Jews with communists, all of them. So children could be killed, anything like that in these small towns. Their role, therefore, was auxiliary compared to the Germans, but sometimes they did damage on their own. I'll just say a little bit more about the work in the pogroms. It wasn't that as I understand it, it wasn't that the OUN started the pogroms, but they were in positions where they could manage the pogrom. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists did not believe in spontaneity, did not believe in spontaneous revolutionary violence. It wanted things to be planned out and carried out in an effective manner. So they played a role in the pogroms, usually by arresting the Jews, and they were deeply involved in humiliation of Jews as well. But they weren't trying to start pogroms. Actually, the OUN program says that they will not have pogroms. That's an interesting story, but nonetheless, faced with the realities of the German occupation and the German thirst for blood, really, in those days, they got deeply involved. I don't think OUN would have, on its own initiative, without the Germans there, have done a big urban pogrom. It's not their way.
And so, I mean, similar to this growth and work on the summer pogroms of 1941, not just in Poland, but in Ukraine and other places in recent historiography, we've also seen really just an enormous amount of publications and literature on something that we kind of commonly now know as the Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe, and in particular places like Ukraine, where Jewish populations are often shot en masse in communities in which they lived by the Germans as well as by other helpers. And this has really kind of helped to shift a general understanding of the Holocaust, often embodied by concentration camps, extermination camps, and ghettos, to this other Holocaust that was happening in Eastern Europe. And your book spends a lot of time in one chapter in particular dealing with this Holocaust by bullets in relation to the OUN and complicity. So I was just wondering if you could tell us more about this and kind of unpack this Holocaust by bullets and what that means in the context of your study.
Okay. where the OUN was working, particularly in Galicia, some of the, about maybe half of the victims were actually sent to a death camp. They were sent to Belzec's death camp, from whom there are hardly any survivors. And you have to understand that this was different than Auschwitz. You know, Timothy Snyder makes the point that Auschwitz has become the symbol primarily because so many people survived in Auschwitz, but nobody survived from these, almost nobody survived from places like Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek, and places like that, because they weren't labor camps. I went to Belzec this summer, and I saw it. It's really very small. And all these death camps were really very small because they didn't have to house anybody. They just housed a small staff. Anyways, so those victims disappeared, but there were also bullets. Very often, what would happen? So by this time, OUN was not rounding up the Jews, but by the time of the Holocaust of bullets, they had already infiltrated the police. The police was the major instrument. So the police would round up the Jewish population and bring them to a ravine or to a pit that was being dug. And there they would be shot, usually by German units, but more and more we're seeing evidence that the police themselves were more involved in the shooting than we thought earlier. So, for example, let's take the book by Wendy Lauer, her new book, The Ravine. The killers there were 2 Ukrainian policemen and 2 or 3 German customs officials who got involved in this terrible thing. So, and this was kind of like the death camps, except that it used soldiers generally or policemen to shoot, German policemen to shoot the Jewish population. Some people managed to survive those shootings, so we have some stories, but generally speaking, the survival rate in the areas of Western Ukraine was very low. It's like about 5% of the Jewish population managed to survive the war. And partially this is because of the nature of the killing, right? The Hungarian Jews were sent, well, they were also mainly killed in Auschwitz, sent into death. But it differed here in that most Jews were killed all at once. You had to be hiding to survive into 1943.
So to turn now to the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or the UPA, depending upon what direction you're coming from or what background knowledge that you may have about this insurgent army, you might be generally confused about what their main task was. You've already kind of laid out a little bit of background on them. Was their main goal fighting their neighbors, the Poles? Was it fighting the Soviet partisans, or the Soviet or soon to be Soviet reoccupation of the region, fighting the Germans, who are also an occupier at this time, or all of the above? And also in contemporary Ukraine today, we see some public officials and other folks who will paint the UPA as this kind of democratic, multi-ethnic army that was seeking to establish democracy in Ukraine. But they seem to play a much more kind of different role in your book, obviously specifically with their involvement in the Holocaust. So we'd like to just hear more about this part of the story.
Okay. The reason there is an UPA was because German policies were so harsh in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, which was a division of the Ukrainian lands, which included Volhynia, which is north of Galicia, but was not in the same jurisdiction as Galicia. It was in a very harsh rule in Reichskommissariat Ukraine. So millions of Ukrainians from the Reichskommissariat in particular were rounded up and sent into forced labor in Germany. Also, the Germans demanded contributions, like heavy taxes, from the population of the Reichskommissariat. People were really anti-German. And Volhynia had been a place where actually in the interwar period, communism was very strong. Pro-Soviet feelings were very strong there. So by the spring of 1943, when Soviet partisans were moving into the area of Volhynia, because Volhynia is a heavily forested region, and that forest extends quite far to the east in Ukraine. It's forest belt. So it was the ideal place to for all partisans. So as the Soviet partisans were moving closer, the OUN realized that they could lose their hold on the population unless they took an anti-German turn. So they started a very calibrated insurrection against the Germans. When I say calibrated, I mean this, that they would, let's say, there were going to be a roundup of Ukrainian youth. And the Germans would come after church, for instance. And as kids came out, they would almost last sue them to take them to Germany for forced labor. So UPA would break that up. They might occasionally ambush a German patrol. But there are things they didn't do. They never liberated any Jewish labor camps. They never did anything to derail the trains, so the German supplies could get through, so that they could fight on that Eastern Front, because they wanted the Germans and the Soviets to pummel each other. So they had an anti-German insurrection, but it's kind of like a rebranding, I think. They wanted the population to understand that they were anti-German, they were for Ukraine. Then, there's this whole mass murder of Poles, but it was also a conflict. I mean, there were also Poles fighting back, and Ukrainian Polish historians argue who started it. I'm pretty sure I know who started it. OUN had a vision of Poles dying in their so-called national revolution. So anyway, so then they fought the Poles, probably killed, I don't know, there's different estimates from 35,000 to 100,000 Poles that were killed by UPA. And then lots of other national minorities were killed by UPA, including Roma, ethnic Germans, Russians, Soviet POWs who were released, and so on. And Jews, they hunted down the Jews. I think that's, do we have all the people OUN fought? Yeah, I think so. Why they did this now, and then there's that story about them becoming a democratic, a multinational democratic force. It's not in my book, but after the book, I understand it much better than I did when I wrote my book. So here's what was happening. It was very clear that Germany was losing the war in the spring of 1943. Very clear. And in June, the OUN holds a conference trying to decide what's going to happen now. What should we do now that we can't rely on kind of a symbiotic relation with these Germans? And so they imagine that there are three possible scenarios. One is that the Americans and British will come up the Balkans and liberate Ukraine. Two, the Soviets will come first and drive the Germans out of Ukraine. but they'll be so exhausted from the war effort that it will be easy to have an insurgency that will drive them out of the country and create an independent Ukraine. The third possibility they considered but dismissed was that the Soviets would drive out the Germans and then establish their permanent rule on the territory of Ukraine. As Ivan Patrolyak, and you know his works as well as I do, said, the third one was the most realistic one, but they completely dismissed it because nobody wants to say, well, geez, we're going to die now. So what they did is they divided their division of labor between certain forces. So Leve, who you no doubt know, was one of their leaders, who was later financed by the United States of America in exile. But he was there for the British and the Americans. And he's the one, therefore, and in light of his task, which was to present a democratic visage of the UPA and of the OUN, they have a program which is totally words about equal rights, democracy, freedom for all nationalities, and that's in case the Americans, British come up the Balkans. And it turned out in the post-war period also be very important. The other, which was associated with people like Roman Shukhevich and Dmytro Kretsnivsky, their task was to clear the ground for the anti-Soviet insurrection. So that involved mass murder of anybody who could possibly want to support the Soviets. So that's when they started killing released Soviet POWs who were working on farms in the country. That's when they had Russian units, believe it or not, in the UPA. They were all murdered. They also said, well, that's one of the reasons for the Poles, because the Poles might seek help from the Soviets, and some of them did. And the Jews were all considered pro-Soviet. And that I don't think was wrong, because although the Soviets meant death for the nationalists, it meant life for the Jews, because their persecutors would be gone. So I think that kind of sums up the situation. UPA in 43, 44 was absolutely paranoid, just paranoid. Least suspicion and they would kill you, because they wanted to clear the ground for their insurrection against the Soviets.
And so this is a topic not necessarily covered explicitly in the book, but something you've written about extensively elsewhere, and that's the politics of memory surrounding, in particular, these two groups, OUN and the UPA, both in terms of scholarly and civil discourse, not only in Ukraine, but more globally. And probably one of the most quoted lines of yours on these topics is that these difficult topics remain a representing blank spot in the collective memory of various Ukrainian communities. And so this may be kind of looking forward or trying to see where we are, given the publication of your book, and also the publication of books from many other colleagues like Struve or Bartov or Radchenko. It's clear that the conditions in which these blank spots have developed are quite different now. And so I guess the question here is, has a deeper and kind of richer historiography on these difficult themes in Ukrainian history to help to add color to these blank spots, or do we still have a ways to go?
I think research never ends. Our understanding of history and life never ends. Scholarship often exists in a world that's very different from the world of politics and public memory. But I would say in the scholarly community in Ukraine, there's certainly a real wealth of younger scholars who are taking up these themes and trying to understand them. You mentioned a number of them. Marta Havrishko works on on these themes, and I gave a little lecture series through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I think I had about 20 students, all of whom were going to be writing about the Holocaust, and all of whom looked to me like they were 22. So yeah, it's changing. I think there's a better understanding of what happened. The next issue of Ukraine Moderna will deal a lot with these issues. So there is a change in the scholarly world, and this has filtered to some degree also elsewhere. I don't see a lot of emphasis by, say, Zelensky on UPA. He does say Slava Ukraini, which is a slogan, but I think there's slow change. But you have to realize that this war is going to change Ukraine. If you look at every big war in which Ukraine was involved, starting from the 1648 rebellion by Khmelnytsky, the 18th century expansion of the Russian Empire to the south, World War I, World War II. From every one of those wars, Ukraine emerged very different, and it's going to be very different again. My wife keeps telling me we're going to go visit in April. I said, she says it's going to be a different country where we're going to. So, but one of the ingredients in the mix will be a more critical understanding of Ukrainian history and trying to work this all out. What does it mean? What does it mean? And how does one integrate the Holocaust into Ukrainian history? And really, it had a huge effect on Ukrainian history. One of the most, Yiddish was once, in Jewish culture, was once a lively, traditional part of the texture. It's gone. The urban population, which had been Polish and Jewish, is gone. Ukrainians and Russians moved in. There was a huge transfer of, maybe not huge, a fairly large transfer of wealth from the populations which were destroyed. Whether it's landholding, apartments, businesses, so there's a lot to factor in, and I think that I say I didn't want to write a definitive book, or I couldn't write a definitive book. Really, there's a lot to figure out. We also have to think, why is the East European perspective different than, say, the Western perspective? So there's a lot to do.
And maybe you've already answered this. I just was one of my questions I definitely want to ask, and I do think you've hit upon this, but yeah, I guess this kind of interesting moment in which this book comes out. I mean, a series of months before this obviously horrific invasion of Ukraine, and then this kind of existential moment for the Ukrainian state trying to survive, dealing with a foreign invader yet again, and you have this book come out like yours is. Very critical look at a difficult part of Ukrainian history, and just maybe, I don't know, some of your maybe just thoughts or your feelings about the kind of overlap of these two events, your book coming out in the war, and then in what role you would kind of see your book as playing in the future.
Well, I think that during the war, I mean, the book came out at an unfortunate time, I would say, because you can't draw from this scholarship kind of public intellectual kind of questions, because now Ukraine has a little bit more to deal with than its radical right nationalists past and present, and so we have to really wait till the end of the war, I think, for a more serious translation of our understanding into our politics. But I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful that the truth and the complexity will will emerge, because no nation's history is particularly beautiful. I mean, I was born in America. You're living in America. We know something about that history. I live in Canada. I know something about what happened to the Indigenous peoples. I look at little Belgium. It had, facing this and incorporating it into our understanding, I think is important. And I think that is bound to happen.
Wonderful. Thank you. So thank you, Professor John Paul Himka, for joining us today for this lively discussion.
Thank you, Jared, for your questions and for inviting me.
Yeah, and I encourage everyone to get the book. And thank you all for listening.